Yes. Yeah? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So Henry, thank you for the introduction. It's really a privilege to be here to lecture in a slightly different format. How many of you have had me for ARC 2701 or 2702 or 5935? I'm seeing people. Okay. But I think a minority. So I'm hopefully a new face and a new voice for the vast majority of you. And I'm doing something today quite different than what, if you've encountered me in the classroom setting, I've done in the past. So in ARC 2701, I tend to teach from roughly 100,000 years ago to the 1400s, and then we pick up where we left off and go till the late 19th century in the second semester. And I try and foreground in those two survey courses, the fall and the spring, four kind of key elements which will hopefully reappear in the lecture I have for you today. So I tend to emphasize the importance of social and political organization and its impact on the built environment. Technology, by which I mean obviously tools and weapons, especially when we're talking about something like the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which my students have an exam on Monday, among other things. Public works, roads, irrigation networks. Also religion and the importance of how different cultures view themselves and the world around them. And food systems, and so how we kind of relate to the land, including kind of the practice of architecture and different means of sustenance. And the irony here is that after these kind of 49 centuries that I cover over 2 semesters, I ostensibly end where my era of expertise begins, and that is the turn of the 20th century. So what I have for you today is part of my own research interests that are really focused on what the historian Eric Hobsbawm has called the Age of Empire, and in particular, the expansion of US interests in different areas of the world at the turn of the 20th century. And for the way I decided to organize the lecture today is really 2 trips. So we'll take a brief first trip, and then I will speak about my current book project, and then we'll delve into kind of more detail into one other trip. So the first trip we're going to at least follow our key protagonists on is a trip to South America that took place from April 23rd to July 13th, 1913. And it was a trip that took place at the behest of the Boston Chamber of Commerce. And you see here the delegates of the commercial mission going on this trip to South America aboard the SS Metapon, a steamship that was departing first for Jamaica, then Panama, then the west coast of South America, then across and onto the east coast to Brazil, back through Barbados, and ultimately back to Boston. And you see them here in this article being referred to as trade tourists off to South America, right? So they are bringing with them the mission of American industry and the goods they have to sell to their counterparts in South America, but also seeking potential natural resources that they can get to then bring back to the United States for their own gain. And they engage in, though they are kind of referred to as trade tourists, they engage in kind of things that you might, still engage in where you go on a cruise today. So you see here on the left, they go and visit the fortress in Cusco, built during the Inca Empire. And then on the right, you see them, erecting a temporary swimming pool on the deck of the steamship to go swim in as they're kind of cruising through warmer climes to cool off. They also visit, perhaps unsurprisingly, what was then still under construction in 1913, the Panama Canal, in what was then U.S. territory, or the Panama Canal Zone. So you see them here going to look at the locks that are still not yet operational. And we can think of the importance of seeing this testament to American engineering mastery, the kind of cleaving together of 2 oceans across the Isthmus of Panama that you see here being kind of portrayed in this cartoon, asking President McKinley at the time of the turn of the 20th century to engage in this effort of joining the 2 seas together, while American goods for foreign countries, which is what's written on the side of some of these ships, await to cross from one ocean to the other. But they also did not just, engage in tourism activities, right? Not seeing just the sights and enjoying the beautiful weather, but they were there for business purposes. And so you see them on the left going to look at the infrastructure built by the United Fruit Company in Jamaica, where there were banana plantations at the time, bringing back tropical commodities to American markets. And then here on the right, actually meatpacking plants operated by Swift, another American company in Argentina, as well as taking a look at the wool exchange, which is the image you see in the top right. And you have to recall in 1913, we are after the Spanish-American War. We are after the annexation of Hawaii. We are in the era of colonization of the Philippines on the behest of the United States, and thus we are dealing not with the contiguous continental United States, but a full-throated empire that has territorial holdings across the Pacific Ocean, in the midst of the Pacific, and also in the Caribbean. But my project is not merely to emphasize this kind of territorial expansion of the United States, but really to focus in on the commercial expansion through private interests of the US at the turn of the 20th century. So here you see a depiction of J.P. Morkey being personified as US industry, and you can see in this cornucopia that he's holding to his side. He's carrying, railroads, ships, weapons, in some sense, suggesting a very different version of expansionary policy than what's being depicted on the bottom with the kind of feudal lords of Europe. And so in some sense, what I'm most keen in this kind of period of study is to look at both the extraction of tropical commodities from things as far as kind of guano that we look at from the Pacific Islands to things like rubber and the failed experiment of Portlandia in Brazil, but also then the project of pushing American goods to these new economies in a different way that this trade mission that was going to Boston, from Boston to South America, was engaged in 1913. So in my research, this is really meant kind of doing two things at once simultaneously. So on the one hand, I've been interested in histories of corporate imperialism that reveal how engineered landscapes funneled resources back to US shores, but also on the other, histories of commercial architecture, like the headquarters of the UFC in New Orleans that you see on the right, and how those kind of represent expressions of corporate identity. And my project, in some ways, is to stitch these two kind of elements together that tend to be spoken in two separate kind of sub-disciplines. So hopefully, this look at the Ford Motor Company will help illustrate my point. So Albert Kahn's design for the Highland Park plant in Dearborn, Michigan marks a key moment in architectural history. It's a kind of placeholder for everything that is modern, scientific, productive, and standardized. But recent scholarship has allowed us to place the rise of the Ford Motor Company and Fordism in a global context, and to better understand how the assembly line extended far beyond the walls of the factory, whether through a family of international subsidiaries as seen here in the diagram below, or an empire of assembly plants located across the world, illustrated in the diagram above. So the system relied on a global division of labor that profited from the production of differences marked by race, nation, and gender. And so the lines on these diagrams then are as much about connectivity as they are about disconnection, right? About the idea of how some things are made to move while others are held in place. As the sociologist and historian W. Du Bois stated in 1903, the same year that Henry Ford incorporated the Ford Motor Company, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and he would later title a separate essay, "The Color Line Belts the World." In the case of Ford, the color line and the assembly line operated as mutually reinforcing forces in the production of men and machines. As Ford expanded globally, company managers made arguments about the desirability and feasibility of racial segregation and national improvement in terms of efficiency and standardization. That is, the history of scientific management and scientific racism not only overlap, but are ultimately coincident. It may be that capital seeks not universalizing victories that standardize all workers by eliminating differences, historian Elizabeth Esch writes, but constant and varied new challenges. In a transnational economic context, growth often requires that development remain uneven. And for architectural historian, this kind of suggests the need for a broader, differentiated frame than that allotted by kind of narrow studies of canonical built works like Ford's Highland Park plant, but also an attentiveness to the social production of difference. And so my current book project, and the title will likely change in the coming months, years, or however long it takes for it to come out, but it's currently titled Transporting Empire, the Architecture of Conveyance and Corporate Imperialism in America. And it tries to identify the architectures, landscapes, and visual cultures of American business as key sites and agents of the United States' territorial and economic expansion at the turn of the 20th century. And it analyzes, in particular, this unique brand of imperialism that was pursued by private interest with at times explicit state support. And it's building off a kind of flurry of recent literature that has come out in the area of kind of US empire studies, both from historians of labor, like you see on the left, popular texts aimed for a broad audience, like Daniel Immerwahr's How to How an Empire in the middle, but then these very interesting edited volume on the right called Crossing Empires that places American imperialism in a trans-imperial terrain. I'm also building off studies by art, visual, and visual culture studies, scholars invested in art history and visual culture. And so there was an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery just last year titled 1898, and a recent text known called Painting US Empire that I'm also showing on the right. So in the broadest sense, transporting empires tries to render visible how access to the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the materials we build with, and the energy we consume is dependent upon vast, often hidden infrastructures, social, cultural, material, that tie our urban livelihoods to the working and living conditions of those elsewhere. And along with corporate headquarters, infrastructure, and what an architectural historian by the name of Alex Bremner has called gray architecture, such as wharves and warehouses, I'm also interested in the visual culture of business, when I've labeled here maps and figures on the right that conceptually shorten the distance and naturalize the relationship between the so-called imposts of US empire and their productive hinterlands. So in a way, I see my work as a way to kind of to reckon with the forces of global capital and the kind of ongoing environmental crisis, and to hopefully seek out areas for strategic resistance. And here I must confess, I am Canadian. I grew up in Canada, and I did so in the wake of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and I see my own work as a kind of effort to make sense of the changes that have occurred since by examining previous iterations of imagined geographic and economic integration, from the Monroe Doctrine to a building like this one, the Pan American Union headquarters in Washington, D.C., now the Organization of American States, to proposals for imperial federation that I'm depicting on the right, or even the kind of recently failed Trans-Pacific Partnership that intended to make a kind of economic grouping out of Pacific-facing countries. So the questions that were applied in this kind of historical era remain kind of still with us today. How do art and architecture inform and enable imperial enterprise? How do they sanction or resist imperial modes of living? How do they support or contest ongoing environmental degradation? And how might we, as a discipline, as a field, as those invested in the building of the built environment, go about countering these kind of hegemonic structures? So during the turn of the 20th century moment, I study large parts of the world that were viewed from the kind of Euro-American perspective as sites for material extraction by racialized labor, and ultimately kind of economic sinks for Euro-American exports. But in the years to come, we will be looking for sinks of a different sort, as more coal, oil, and natural gas are burned. The so-called limits to growth will be experienced not as the problem of finite resources, but a scarcity of sinks in which to store carbon emissions. And I'm showing images here from the Commercial Museum of Philadelphia, which was actually founded out of the collections of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. And it was a kind of clearinghouse for information for manufacturers who were invested in perhaps selling their wares to foreign countries, but didn't know how to do so. So a kind of commercial diplomatic mission in the heart of Philadelphia. But we will now be taking our second voyage, and the voyage we'll be taking goes to Philadelphia from the port city of, from Philadelphia to Jamaica, and it takes place in 1904, so roughly 10 years before the trip that we just followed out of the city of Boston in 1913. So on January 11, 1904, 3 doctors set out on a trip aboard the Beverly, a steamship owned and operated by the United Fruit Company, from Philadelphia, and they were headed to Port Antonio, Jamaica. But as soon as they boarded, the images the doctors had conjured of luxury travel were quickly dashed by the reality they were plying the seas aboard a working banana boat. Before boarding, Dickey, who was also known as Dr. S. Van Jones, you can see him there, had, quote, filled their minds with the glorious accommodations to be enjoyed on the Beverly, unquote. Likely assuming they would be traveling aboard one of the company's new Admiral-class steamships, ships that had been designed for the Spanish-American War but were never put into service, Dickey spoke of, quote, spacious palm rooms with huge platters groaning with the delicacies of the season, where fountains tinkled and the band played, and beautiful maidens playing rings and shuffleboard on the broad white decks, while immaculate Ethiopians plied the blasé traveler with smokes and cooling drinks, end quote. But all was not as advertised. Instead of the delights and wonders that had been kind of advertised by travel agents, the doctors had stepped on, or had tripped on in reality, expiring bananas on their way in, and now sat in the Beverly's cramped smoking room, which, quote, resembled the funeral parlor of the Third Avenue undertaker's establishment. Now, their photo album of their kind of 2-week trip to Jamaica should not really kind of be taken at its word. The account is littered with hyperbole, but their travelogue does seem to capture, if unintentionally, the challenges of traveling at sea aboard one of the banana industry steamers prior to the full-scale implementation of a key technical innovation, namely refrigeration. So as soon as bananas are cut, they begin to ripen. And this process is triggered by the release of ethylene gas that turns them from green to yellow and converts starch to sugars. And chilled air helps keep bananas green longer, ultimately by allowing them to travel further distances. So the rotting fruit that the doctor stepped on while boarding was not merely evidence of a working pier in an unkept deck, but a kind of fundamental reality of the challenges associated with transporting tropical fruit to temperate climes without the recourse to onboard refrigerating plants to delay their kind of natural ripening process. So the fruit was a kind of casualty, you might say, of both temperature and time. Now, Arnold and his colleagues represented a new and somewhat apprehensive class of US tourists that were traveling south to escape the winter weather. And with a voyage to Europe kind of being out of the question due to rough seas and chilling winds, a trip to the Caribbean with its summer-like weather was kind of advertised as an appealing proposition. As an article in the Golden Caribbean, this kind of magazine that was published by the United Fruit Company at the time, asked, quote, "What more delightful break in the monotony of a winter could be imagined?" Unquote. This represented a shift, as historians like Mark Carey and Catherine Cox have shown, in the image and meaning of the tropics in Anglo-American culture and society that took place throughout the latter half of the 19th century. Transformed in the eyes of would-be travelers from a so-called white man's grave to the white man's sanatorium, the tropics shed their perilous associations with death and disease and became attractive as temporary respite for physically and mentally overworked white Americans. In the opening decades of the 20th century, especially after the First World War, tourism in the Caribbean boomed despite the writings and warnings of figures associated with scientific racism, particularly those who tried to draw explicit connections between climate, race, and quote-unquote degree of civilization. In a sense, this was a related effect of a weakened belief in environmental determinism, the belief that similar natural zones produce similar kinds of people, but also a steadfast commitment to the environment's potentially to be at least kind of transformative, if not determinative. So historian Catherine Cox attributes the shift to a new conception of race anchored in culture that helped alleviate white people's fears of going quote-unquote native to the point of no return. But guarding against these fears of degeneration was also a kind of technical armature, the one I'm interested in studying, that worked to preserve the Northerners' constitution while traveling for their eventual return to cooler climes. So we might say that what UFC sold was access to the tropics, whether consumed at home or experienced abroad, through the implementation and maintenance of infrastructures and transportation and systems of environmental control. And such access to the peripheries of US empire also helped, as others have argued, consolidate the place of an American tropics within a continental imaginary. So passengers traveling south and tropical fruit shipped north moved along these kind of shared lines and spaces, like this 2-story freight and passenger terminal in that UFC built in Cuba, but none of these was kind of more iconic or important than the steamship. So by the late 1920s, the United Fruit Company owned and operated dozens of refrigerated steamships that carried hundreds of thousands of bananas to the US, Great Britain, and Canada, and ferried tourists as well as mail-in freight to the Caribbean. And in this, kind of UFC followed the example set by the transcontinental railroads' earlier expansion southward and westward, as well as their subsequent construction of tourist destinations as a means of generating traffic, so the kind of push and pull that's involved in these specific industries. For example, the rebuilt Titchfield Hotel that you see here on the right in Port Antonio, the first stop on the doctor's trip to Jamaica, was owned and operated by a UFC affiliate. So to ask why UFC invested so heavily in bananas is in some sense to put the cart before the horse. Traffic is the end. Bananas, and to a lesser extent tourism, are the means. So UFC's imperial practices have been studied by labor, environmental, and business historians, as well as a kind of slew of prominent scholars of US foreign relations. And the company offers a kind of prominent case study of the United States' particular brand of imperialism pursued by private interest with state support often to disastrous ends. But relatively little has been written about the UFC's Great White Fleet, those kind of great ships that we just saw in that previous image, and the related tourist trade, and even less about the company's stateside distribution networks, which were operated by a subsidiary known as the Fruit Dispatch Company. So building off this kind of existing scholarship, what I'm trying to capture here is the heat line's specific use of portable climates as a process of quote-unquote thermal colonization, or the use of a sense of temperature to justify colonial expansion and inhabitation. And in UFC's case, this infrastructure helped and mediated the encounter of kind of two Americas. So we have the kind of cluster of tropical banana-producing nations on the left, promoted as Middle America by the company's own Middle America Information Bureau, and the kind of other Middle America, the Middle America of temperate Midwestern consumer markets that lay outside the company's reach prior to the extension of transcontinental refrigerated supply chains. But first, we go back to January 13th, 1904. Only 2 days after the Beverly had left Philadelphia, Arnold, one of our kind of doctors taking part in this trip, his nap was interrupted when he heard spattering and gurgling near the bow. As he would later write, quote, "A rich butyric odor was wafted aft. The small donkey engine on the forward deck was hoisting sloughing and necrotic fruits and baskets dripping with iridescent slime from the murky, nauseating hole," a kind of vivid imagery of what was taking place. They splattered and disintegrated like toadstools in the sunshine, leaving long, gray-green, oily streaks in the pure blue ocean. Arnold's recollection kind of captures, if floridly, the challenges of shipping perishable produce without the technology required to delay its putrefaction, that is, without the means of conditioning the banana's natural ripening process and mitigating its risk of bruising. In the United States, refrigerated rail cars with natural ice had been in use since the 1850s, but they only became common once adopted by the Chicago-based packer Gustavus Swift in the late 1870s. These allowed Swift and others to transport dressed meat rather than live animals, eliminating the time required for feeding in transit and the need for terminal slaughterhouse facilities. Cold stores, for their part, as architectural historian Michael Osman, among others, has shown, served to preserve perishable things, fruit, vegetables, meat, dairy, for prolonged periods of time, and in doing so helped insulate, metaphorically, these same perishables from the effects of unstable economic demand. Whereas Greek temples were used to house the kind of statues of deities, Swift's display at the World's Columbian Exposition replaced them with frozen carcasses, kind of testament to the longevity of his product's shelf life. To support the growth of its own kind of hemispheric banana trade, UFC promoted the use of shipboard refrigerating plants, emulating the British Empire's frozen meat trade, and built its cold chain across the Americas through a creation of an extensive network of refrigerated ships and ice plants in the Caribbean, the US, and Canada. And UFC controlled, to a large extent, the entirety of their products' kind of distribution, allowing them to regulate, or rather condition, the market in bananas themselves. And this kind of control of the chain ultimately led to control of the market. And this conditioning took on a kind of number of dimensions, beginning with the creation of this subsidiary that I mentioned, the Fruit Dispatch Company, whose primary function through its 52 branch houses that you're seeing here as dots on this map, was to forecast, to kind of anticipate the consumption of bananas and to ensure their distribution of the approximately 45 million bunches of banana that at the time entered the US kind of every year. We're going to follow this trajectory a little. So from farm to table. By the 1930s, UFC owned and operated some 1,700 miles of railways and tramways, as well as nearly 100 ships. The steamships in of themselves were kind of considerable improvement over the sailing vessels that had initially plied the Caribbean Sea. They were not only kind of much faster than their earlier wind-powered counterparts, but also much more reliable, allowing the company to tailor US-based consumption to its plantation's production. Again, the push and pull being kind of tried to matching one another. As an early student of UFC's transportation system noted, quote, "Speed and dependability of sailings, prime essentials in banana transport, furnish the basis upon which passenger traffic was built up." And if you kind of, block off the bottom half of the ship, you can almost imagine how the kind of upper portion where tourists would have kind of had their rooms kind of featured a pair of these like deep decks with overhangs that almost kind of look like a hotel designed for the tropics here sitting on top of a cargo ship. The prototypical banana plantation was designed to extend no more than kind of 2,400 feet on either side of a company railroad to ensure rapid delivery after a cutting order had been placed. So despite the fact that the banana kind of comes in its own protective natural packaging, bananas typically had to be in the cool hub of a company ship within 24 hours of cutting, so a very time-sensitive production process. As the steamship neared port, a call was placed through the company's radio infrastructure maintained by then another subsidiary, the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company, which was then relayed to individual plantations. And at tropical ports, as you can see here in the bottom left, loading would kind of commence immediately upon arrival, and this is actually a kind of travelogue taken by a stewardess from 1935 while she's looking at loading take place in Bowden, Jamaica. For shorter routes, such as trips between the port of New Orleans and the Caribbean, UFC experimented with naturally ventilated ships, such as the Iriona seen here, but by 1930, fully 3/4 of their ships were equipped with refrigerating plants. The Talamanca, for instance, was equipped with 3 separated refrigerated cargo holds, 1 for air-cooled cargo, 1 for special cargo, and a 3rd for the ship's own stores or the food that you would use to kind of feed the guests aboard while they were traveling. And the failure of these kind of cold storage technologies led to rather eventful breakdowns. So in 1917, a UFC steamship's refrigerating equipment failed on its return trip from the Caribbean, allowing its cargo of 27,000 bunches of bananas to begin ripening en route. And then once docked, the workers were kind of struggling to lift these bananas out of the hole as they kind of disintegrated under their own weight, which ultimately led to this scene where you had a kind of layer of banana mush covering the entire area in a kind of layer of thick soup. At New Orleans, which with its kind of companion ports of Mobile, Alabama and Galveston, Texas, supplied kind of 2/3 of the US market, banana piers were equipped with specialized unloading machines that replaced the need for human labor and expedited the transshipment off the ships as quickly as possible onto rail cars. And these machines, kind of adjustable booms, could be extended outward and then gently lowered into the hull of ships of any size. During summer months, the Fruit Dispatch Company was charged with kind of cooling these cars in advance, and these refrigerated cars were equipped with slatted racks, ice bunkers, and adjustable ventilators that would keep the bananas cool for the most of their journey. But the company also operated a series of kind of re-icing stations as the bananas moved throughout the continental United States, as another series of kind of key junction points, Rouse's Point, New York, Mounds, Illinois, and Dubuque, Iowa. During winter months, when unusually cold weather risked damaging the cargo, these cars would be switched into heating sheds, another kind of architecture and environmental control, and warmed using either blower systems or steamed radiators. And then when they finally arrived at one of their kind of Fruit Dispatch Company's branch offices, these would then be transferred into so-called distributors' banana rooms that you're seeing on the left, which only worked like the hulls but on land. And Charles E. Moore, the kind of engineer responsible for the developing of the patented Moore refrigeration system for banana ripening rooms, kind of would later equip his own Spanish colonial home, which is what I'm showing on the right, with a kind of similar air conditioning system. So cooling technologies designed for bananas were hence supplied to humans, namely Charles E. Moore himself. As historians Frank Taylor and James W. Martin have shown, UFC played a central role in creating Jamaica's reputation as a health resort at the turn of the 20th century. Owing to the staggeringly high death rate among soldiers stationed on the island throughout the 19th century, Jamaica had been initially referred to by its European colonizers as quote-unquote the white man's grave. This was initially ascribed to the island's tropical atmosphere or bad air, and this led kind of British officers to seek refuge in the mountains' cooler climes above the plains where the air was believed to be foul, and over time these hill stations became destinations in and of themselves. Coupled with access to mineral springs that were believed to cure gout and rheumatism to kind of conditions that plagued people at the turn of the 20th century, the island's atmosphere were what drew late 19th century tourists, mainly seeking kind of remedy or escape from afflictions associated with winter weather. So this reprieve from the North's temperature extremes was also sold as a kind of corrective to the increasingly cold nature of urban life in late 19th century US cities. Early on, the company publicized Jamaica as providing relief from distress associated with quote-unquote over-civilization, a diagnosis rooted in the increasingly sedentary, consumerist lifestyles of the middle and upper classes. As Reverend J. Wilbur Chapman offered in a testimonial published in the November 1903 issue of the Golden Caribbean, quote, "To anyone seeking simply pleasure, I would say, by all means take this winter journey, but to anyone suffering from nervous exhaustion, I would say with emphasis, there is no climate that I have ever found in the world that could equal the climate of the West Indies to restore such a one to perfect health," unquote. And so these kind of therapeutic considerations also dovetailed with promoters' depictions of Jamaica's indigenous and free black inhabitants whose perceived primitivism was itself a kind of attraction to people coming in the early 20th century. Touring the Caribbean thus entailed not just kind of traveling south to warmer climes, but also traveling, if not back in time, then at least somewhere where time was supposedly lived and felt differently. So you can see them here retracing the steps of the conquerors throughout the Caribbean. So like the technologically mediated arrest of the banana's natural ripening process in the steamship's hold, the tourist pace was believed to kind of slow and be suspended while they were engaged in touring the Caribbean. And this mediation was premised on a range of practices that allowed Arnold and his colleagues, like other tourists, to avoid the exposure to the full force of the island's heat. For instance, after dropping off their bags at the Titchfield Hotel, the doctors rushed to Smith's Emporium in Port Antonio to purchase what they called yippa yappas, better known as Panama hats, to shield their heads and faces from the sun, and to complete their culturally and climatically appropriate head-to-toe tropical attire. The emphasis on the need for ventilation and shade at the scale of the body also applied to the architecture of the Titchfield Hotel, which would be rebuilt following designs by Boston-based architect Thomas M. Sargent shortly after they visited in 1904. So built before the start of the 1905 winter season, the hotel that emerged from Sargent's design applied this logic of the colonial bungalow to a new 5-story building. And articles announcing the hotel promised an interior arrangement, quote, graceful and tropical in aspect, with large and light halls and rooms, spacious piazzas, ample ventilation, and abundance of windows, as well as, quote, a complete system of gravity drains to carry off all moisture and dampness. As seen in this kind of ground floor plan published in the Golden Caribbean, the hotel's common spaces, the billiard room, the music room, the ladies' room, and the dining hall, were arranged along a kind of central spine that connected to the hotel's extensive covered veranda, which was open to the outdoors to allow for natural ventilation. Guest rooms on the upper floors that you see on the left featured shutters above the interior hall-facing doors that were similarly intended to promote cross-ventilation. And perhaps unsurprisingly, designs for the new hotel included, quote, the installation of a 10-ton plant for refrigerating and other purposes, unquote. In 1937, when 4 well-heeled couples traveled from Chicago to New York to Cuba to Jamaica to Bermuda and back, stopping at the Myrtle Bank Hotel, another of the company's affiliates along the way, they made a point of photographing their waiter as he approached in a crisp white uniform with a round of ice-cold drinks on a tray. Now, we may not be accustomed of thinking about ice cubes as the product of imperial enterprise, but the machines used to produce them were likely similar to the ones operating on the company's plantations and aboard their ships. Likewise, the refrigeration of the Great White Fleet's own kind of stores for their ships and food aboard passengers on deck radically kind of altered the variety and quality of food available to those traveling, just as it did the fare available to the tourists who were staying at the Titchfield or Myrtle Bank Hotel. In 1904, Arnold's assessment of the Beverly's menu was kind of rather dire. We will say little about the meals on the Beverly. They served a purpose by keeping soul and body together and by giving some excuse to the execrable odors. Lunch was easily the worst. Pollard pickles, malignant coleslaw, and curling films of meat in sparse array decorate the board. And 3 decades later, when a kind of banana bunch-shaped menu for a tropical dinner on the UFC's twin-screw steamer Toloa listed items such as iced celery, fresh asparagus, banana foam ice cream, kind of evidence of the ship's working refrigeration plant. In addition to cooling the ship's stores, the ship's refrigeration plants were also used, beginning in the 19-teens, to cool passenger cabins. The plants kept the bananas at a steady 53 to 55 degrees, but ducts also led from these refrigerating machines to all the staterooms. If a passenger found it too warm, they could slide open a flap in the register overhead, and you kind of see it up here, visible in this photograph, kind of directly adjacent to the ceiling-mounted light fixture. As Frederick Upham Adams asked in his 1914 company-sponsored History of the Firm's Operations, titled Conquest of the Tropics, quote, "What terror is there to tropical heat or humidity when a touch of the hand can turn on the cold as easily as a child can turn the valve of a steam radiator?" Tapping into a much longer history of the thermal colonization of the tropics prior to the introduction of refrigeration, the apertures through which this cold air passed were named punka louvers, after the punka or panka ceiling-mounted fan found in the homes of British colonials and southern planters. So many scholars have studied how Western conceptions and depictions of peoples and places between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn led to contradictory views of the tropics as both kind of paradisiacal, with fertile soils and soothing climes, but equally pestilential and morbid, and thus believed to be exclusively inhabited by backward peoples lacking in civilization. And this twofold framing opened the door to colonial powers' so-called civilizing missions and justified the subsequent installation of extractive industries intent on the commodification of tropical resources. That said, a great deal of the scholarship on tropicality, as architectural historian Jiahui Chang and Anthony D. King note, has mostly focused on medical and environmental discourses and pictorial and literary representations, and not the built environment. But acclimatization, what some have argued to be the quote-unquote paradigmatic colonial science, often relied on architectural devices and details, larger windows, thinner roofs, porticos, and verandas, that colonial officers noted helped adapt temporal styles and ways of building to warmer climates. Now, acclimatization differs from climatic determinism, or theories that essentially see societies as determined by their climatic origins, in that it presupposes the mediation of the impact on climate on humans through culture. For instance, a cult of work that opposes the perceived weakening force of heat in hot regions, or technology, as in the technical production of shade, or as you've heard so far today, refrigeration. From a certain Euro-American perspective, heat, the media theorist Eva Horn argues, quote, melds the boundaries of man and nature between the inside and the outside of the body, between perception and imagination, between the subject and the object of cognition, quote. The tropics thus threaten to dissolve the boundaries embedded within so-called temperate societies, and in this way the color line that separated black and white was reinscribed through refrigerating and ventilating technologies onto a heat line that separated hot from cold, illness from health, and abundance from profit. In a way, the mechanical introduction of cold into tropical locales offered a kind of counterpoint to what the environmental determinist F. Colin Gilfillan termed the Cold War course of progress. According to Gilfillan, the so-called path of supremacy had followed a northward course out of Sumeria through Constantinople, Rome, and Peking, and then ultimately triumphed in the cities of London, New York, and Berlin, migrating northward over time to increasingly cooler climes. The heat line, along with its tropical hygiene and medicine, promised to end this northward migration, allowing the white race to not only temporarily enjoy, but permanently inhabit the tropics. As one source quoted in the UFC-sponsored proceedings of the International Conference on Health Problems in Tropical America claimed, quote, if the white man cannot be made fit for the climate, technical skill and industry backed by science make the climate fit for him. Now, I would be remiss not to use this as an opportunity in some ways to do kind of some future promotion. So in the kind of 2 seminars that I've had a chance to teach here at FIU, I've tried to help us kind of collectively unlearn as a discipline the legacies of such colonial thought and related action, actions that betray historical insensitivity, at times evidence of cunning exploitation, at other times just simply willful ignorance, to the specificities of place and climate. Last spring, a group of students and I delved into the intertwined histories of climate, climate, health, and leisure, moving from 18th century Rome and the Grand Tour to last chance tourism in the Arctic. And here you kind of have the idea of boarding a kind of diesel-powered cruise ship to catch a glimpse of the glaciers before the melt as just kind of one of the many tragic ironies that we have to kind of contend with. This semester, a new group, including a small gathering of repeat customers, is developing a series of proposals for small-scale exhibitions on the history of the tropics from without and within, from Alexander von Humboldt to Bad Money, which we had an interesting discussion about this morning at the Perez Art Museum. At the heart of the kind of both seminars I've had the luxury of teaching is a belief that architecture and the infrastructure of travel and trade, particularly in tropical commodities like bananas, are these kind of understudied protagonists in the history of the built environment, as well as histories of the present-day realities of environmental degradation and empire. But there's also a kind of suggestion that we might not have strayed as far as we would like to believe from this early turn of this 20th century moment. On the one hand, some have argued that we've already entered a quote-unquote new Gilded Age, or a second Gilded Age, characterized by heightened wealth inequality, anti-democratic tendencies, and brazen political corruption. After threatening the annexation of Greenland, Panama, and Canada, and explicitly calling for renewed territorial expansion, the White House floated plans just a few weeks ago for a triumphal arch in the nation's capital, suggesting a rather emphatic political and aesthetic investment in the project of empire. On the other hand, tourists still flock to Florida in large numbers, despite rising seas and record heat. And those headed for travel aboard Caribbean-bound cruise ships might be relieved to find their vessels equipped with snow grottos should they find the heat enervating and air conditioning wanting. The spectacularization of thermal comfort, if you will, that makes earlier recourse to natural ventilation kind of seem ultimately quaint. In the early 19th century, as we've studied this semester, acclimatization underpinned colonial expansion and belief in man's mastery over nature. Activities associated with the acclimatization included kind of British imperial botanist transplantation of Peruvian cinchona plants to India to help ward off the effects of malaria, and the baiting that you see here on the right of French colonists in mineral waters to quote-unquote season new arrivals in Guadeloupe. At a smaller scale, the material culture of acclimatization counted a whole host of objects and devices, from pith helmets that you're seeing here on the screen to punkas that I've talked about earlier, as well as architectural elements that were deployed to help kind of white settlers and colonial officers adapt to life in alien environments. Now, given the reality of planetary warming, it's no surprise scholars have begun excavating these histories of climatic design and their colonial origins, foregrounding the continuities that link discourses of acclimatization to present-day talk of sustainable development and urban resilience. Whereas soldiers, sailors, and missionaries and settlers were on the move then, climates, so to speak, are on the move now. This has given rise to new theories of acclimatization, we might say, that deal with the adaptations needed for people to remain in place. Whether flood infrastructure designed to protect against sea level rise in New York, or undersea cooling needed to host a World Cup in the desert. 2 weeks ago, we had the pleasure of hearing from Professor Mauricio Quiros, a former colleague of mine who's now at the University of Toronto, and our very own Professor Henry Rueda, who offered kind of takes on their own personal takes on tropical architecture and kind of showcased their professional work. And in this kind of unexpected twist of fate, in his presentation, Mauricio showed us a photograph of one of the United Fruit Company building like this one, finding in the floorboards, if you will, the kind of seeds of an architectural program that sits lightly on the land, works with prevailing breezes, foregrounds an economy of means, and makes do without mechanical ventilation. In contrast to the heaviness and expense of imported modernist forms, Mauricio asked us to consider whether there might be an intelligence of sorts that could be redeployed to alternative ends latent within the company's approach to architecture. Are there ideas there that could be cannibalized? And we were talking about the Cannibalism Manifesto this morning with students, which is why it's on my mind, to support different, more just, climate-conscious futures. That is, How might such histories help inform or critique designs intended to adjust cities and buildings to the ongoing, unevenly experienced effects of climate change and ultimately resist the project of empire? Thank you. Questions? Someone ask something.
There's one here.
Yeah. Oh, good question. I think initially I was seeking, I started not with the bananas, but with companies. And I stumbled on this travelogue, which seemed to be rich as a kind of primary source to, in some sense, narrate a history around, right? It's a voyage that both starts in the United States, but then brings you to the Caribbean, but also brings you back. And by, in some ways, hitching my historical narrative onto their actual travel, I can kind of point to different things that take place at the time and the different kind of spaces and technologies that allowed their voyage to take place in a way, and their dissatisfaction in this case with it. But it becomes helpful precisely because of the kind of the scope and expanse of the company, right? It's funny that initially there was this kind of idea of these as a luxury item, but by the kind of massive installation of this large-scale infrastructure that's being used to manipulate environments, to manipulate temperature, to allow these bananas to kind of go further into North America, they ultimately kind of end up getting, a claim to the entire market, and they end up at places like Montreal and finding like places that I'm familiar with kind of appearing in this periodical in the early 19 teens. So the banana came after, if that makes sense. Yeah.
There's
It's a beautiful presentation, thank you. But I was sitting next to Henry, and I don't know if people know who this is, but I said, oh, we're kind of in a Wes Anderson movie right now. We'll appreciate it. I don't know if anyone else knows who Wes Anderson is. Yes, you know him? Yeah. So, but to the point, like I'm curious, like this is about empire building, but I think the parallel story, which is coming out, is the Americana.
Mm-hmm.
Like, America's, and I mean this United States image of itself as being something that's probably early 20th century, right about your time.
Yeah.
Think of Ralph Lauren or any of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, because it's sort of in the slides.
Yeah.
You're talking about the empire and sort of the global condition, and I'm curious if you think about that at all.
The title is escaping me, but there's a wonderful book called, I think it's called Manliness and Civilization, which is precisely about kind of Rough Riders and this image of a kind of frontier, in some sense the closure of the frontier, and then some suggestion that there now has to be a different outlet for this idea of the kind of pioneering spirit that has to go elsewhere, right? And so there's another wonderful book about precisely these middle managers that might have had a very different career had they lived 30 years earlier, but then end up signing up to become an officer in the United Fruit Company in Panama because it affords a kind of imaginary of what they think, a hardy American should be engaged in at the turn of the 20th century, right? Engaging in kind of foreign lands, people that they don't quite understand. So there's an entire kind of sensibility, and I think it's quite telling that when people are seeking to go back to an earlier time, it really seems like it's this time they have in mind,
Right.
not an earlier one, to the height of kind of territorial expansion, to a certain might. It's not for nothing that I think Mount Denali has been renamed or has gone back to Mount McKinley, president who was in power at the time of the Spanish-American War. So there's a kind of idea that this is the height of what American society was, and there were perhaps fewer constraints on what they believed they ought to be able to do. Someone asked something.
There's another one here.
Yeah. Where?
If refrigeration never was invented, how exactly would this played out? Like, would there have been any expansion at all? Like, I mean, you mentioned it started at the beginning and they couldn't really do much at all without refrigeration. So how do you think history would have played out differently?
I think the expansion of the market would have been kind of smaller, and so you have the use of naturally ventilated ships that were able to make the trip from the Caribbean to ports on the kind of southern coast of the United States, like New Orleans, that allowed that to take place. And they could have been perhaps rather ingenious with the deployment of tools and machines that used natural ice or artificially produced ice to also kind of achieve similar ends. But it certainly would have prevented the possibility of the kind of global cold chain that we have today that allows us to have kind of lamb from New Zealand on our grocery shelves and not really think twice about it as being a rather kind of astounding feat of infrastructural might.
Is there a way to look at the way you're framing everything
Yeah.
to a slightly more positive lens? It seems to me that this idea of like the contemporary imperialism, American imperialism is obviously seen through a kind of critical lens, but is it possible to look at everything in a more optimistic rather than pessimistic way?
About what though? About the expansion?
More expansion of American influence worldwide.
Certainly some people would make that argument. I think the details of the story in specific places that I'm looking would suggest otherwise. But I think other people would just contest that for sure.
It's a rhetorical question.
I think there's a yearning. I think that's what's at the heart of this story. There's a yearning for the belief in the kind of might and mastery over nature, land, territory, and peoples that was embedded within this moment of history that people still cling to and want to go back to in many ways. It's hard to imagine what a different role for a nation that doesn't have that as its core is, right? It's kind of an open-ended question. But I think there's certain seeds, like I was really, like it's still with me this moment in Mauricio's presentation from a few weeks ago about suggesting that it's true that regardless of who builds any type of building, right, that initial moment of its creation is not necessarily the kind of meaning that attaches with it forever, and meaning can be re-embedded or re-ascribed to a certain structure. And in this case, he was very kind of suggestive to my mind in thinking about the kind of ingeniousness, the economy of means, the mobility, the lightness, the ephemerality, the kind of ways that these structures that are inhabiting the landscape in some ways seem more appropriate perhaps to the climate than the kind of importation of modernist architectural styles that were heavy, hard to manage climatically, perhaps less successful in other ways. So there might be ways to turn back as architects in this way to some of these earlier moments in histories that may seem challenging, difficult, complicated, tragic, horrific, frankly, but to find the seeds of a project that might be used and redeployed to subvert it to alternative ends with different possibilities for a different type of future in mind. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on this concept, a big picture, I think that thematically we're also talking about how empires rise and fall.
Yeah.
And conceptually, if the American empire is in a fall state and a rising state relative to different points in history, etc. I think it's not a question, but I think one of the things that we think about is that although there have been many empires throughout history with different rates of success, I think that there is let's say, a kernel of American imperialism that may be different than other empires that have risen and fallen, and what that looks like versus the American ingenuity and capitalism and expansion led to, and how we have been successful to a certain extent versus, I guess, other empires, and looking at those as failed empires and the remnants of that versus maybe an existing empire that's still, I don't know, it's an ongoing project.
Yeah, the only reservation I might have is the suggestion of success. That might depend on where you're looking from. If you're on the receiving end of U.S. imperial practice, you might not think it's so successful. But there's a suggestion, I think, that there is a history there, and it's kind of, I'm not a contemporary political commentator, but to try and understand where we are, perhaps, in some suggestion of cyclical notion of rise and fall would be helpful to kind of make sense of both this moment. But my kind of contribution, if there is one to be made with this project, is really perhaps the kind of unique character that takes place when territorial expansion hits the kind of western coast of the United States, and then instead of engaging in further territorial expansion, though they do end up colonizing the Philippines, there's a different kind of idea of what American empire entails that's mostly commercial in nature, right? And that's why that that trip that seems so kind of juicy, which I've just come across now, the Boston Chamber of Commerce going to South America, suggests a kind of different infrastructure, not one of territorial occupation, but of commercial penetration, which has a different kind of body of built works associated with it that can be studied in a different way. Thank you.